Could clothing with suspected leprosy on it ever be considered clean? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Leviticus on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Leviticus 13. We're going to be reading from verses 53 to 59. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Leviticus chapter 13, beginning at verse 53. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which is the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. And the priest shall examine the plague after it has been washed, and indeed if the plague has not changed its color, though the plague has not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eating away, whether the damage is outside or inside. If the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp, or out of the woof, or out of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it is a spreading plague. You shall burn with fire that which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either warp or woof, or whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time and shall be clean. This is the law of the leprous plague in the garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean. So far in this chapter, we've dealt with what would happen if the plague of leprosy was found on a person and the uncleanness associated with it. We've noted that the leprosy being discussed is not necessarily what we would call leprosy today, but it would certainly include that. What is called leprosy here are most of the time skin blemishes that have either become infected or appear contagious. Someone was going to be declared unclean if they had these, for if one was unclean, one couldn't sacrifice in the tabernacle and thus defile the holy things with what could be contagious disease. This designation also was made so as not to allow the spread of disease throughout the camp, causing an epidemic. The procedure when you had what could be described as leprous sores was to go to the priest for examination. They were the only ones who could declare someone clean or unclean, so that is why they were chosen. In our last episode, we discussed what would happen if leprosy or an infectious disease was found on your clothing. The same process applied. You would bring it to the priest for examination. If he determined that the conditions were met where the garment might be contaminated, he would isolate it for 7 days, and if the disease spread, the garment would be considered unclean and burned. Coming to today's reading, we have the rest of these instructions. After those first 7 days, if the priest examines the clothing and the disease has not spread in any part of the clothing, then the priest will command that the clothing be washed to see what will happen. We know that washing our clothing, especially in hot water and with soap, will often kill the bacteria that might be present, thus cleansing our clothes of any disease that might be on them. So too was the purpose here. After the clothes were washed, they would again be isolated 7 days to see what would happen to the disease. When those 7 days were up, the priest would again examine the clothing, and if the disease had not changed in color, even though it had not spread, it was still unclean and was to be burned with fire. Why was this instruction given? Because the disease is still present, and washing with water doesn't seem to affect it. So what made the garment to be possibly unclean in the first place remains. Further washing would also likely be futile, so the clothing needed to be burned. However, if after those second 7 days, when the priest examines the clothing and the disease appears faded, then he will tear the affected part out of the garment. That part could be patched later. If the disease appeared again on this clothing, then it is obvious that it had spread but just didn't manifest itself to the sight yet. The garment is to be regarded as unclean and then burned. If after the washing and isolation, behold, the garment was fully cleaned, in other words, there was no spot on it, then the garment didn't need to be torn, it simply needed to be washed again, and it would be considered clean. Obviously, this was the best case scenario, as what would have been on it wasn't contagious and had been fully removed. This was the law concerning that which was called leprosy found in clothing. So that concludes chapter 13. There is still one more chapter dealing with more regulations concerning leprosy. It will take us 5 episodes to cover that chapter, but the next 3 especially are going to be very important to watch, for they help explain Jesus' instructions to some of the lepers he heals in our studies of the Gospels. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Leviticus 14, verses 1 to 9, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.